watch this on the library's website if you'd like to do that.
All right, thank you, Kristen. Appreciate the invitation to be here tonight. Just a little bit more about myself. I work for the University of Arizona, and I'm the director of the Safford Agricultural Center, which is so the University of Arizona is part of the land grant system. So we receive federal funding to do agricultural research and extension, which basically means you take ag research or other types of research, but mainly dealing with the agricultural sciences. You do that research, you find out answers, you ask questions, and then you disseminate that information to your clientele, which in my case, as an agricultural researcher, it is the growers, the producers, the farmers in the state of Arizona. So I'm based here in Safford. We've got about a 70-acre farm out on Monteith Lane, and but I run a cotton research program across the state of Arizona. So I have research plots from Safford all the way to Yuma, and do different types of research, mainly dealing with cotton. Probably 95% of what I do is related to cotton. So I'm involved very heavily with cotton research, and do a little bit with corn too, and then also some alternative crops. But just to kind of start out, I want to give you kind of a feel for who I am and where I'm coming from. How many of you have heard of GMOs? You all know what GMOs are. You've heard the term before anyway, right? And biotechnology. So what I want you to understand is I'm coming from a position that I'm very much in favor of GMOs. I've seen what they've done for American agriculture and agriculture across the world. And so I even receive funding from research from companies that are involved in developing GMOs. And so they fund some of my research. So I just want to make sure that you guys understand where I'm coming from and my perspective. And I think by the end of this slide set, you'll know definitely where I stand when it comes to some of these technologies. We're going to define some terms related to biotechnology, GMOs, talk a little bit about the history of GMOs, where they started, where they've come from, what are some of the GMOs or genetically modified crops that we have in use today, and what are the benefits, how have they been adopted, why are they important, what has it done for us, what has it done for you as a consumer. You might look at some of this stuff and say, well, how does that benefit me as a consumer? Well, hopefully through this presentation, you'll get an idea or a feel for how some of these products might benefit you. We'll talk about some of the future projects and technologies that are coming down the line. Some pretty exciting things that are coming down the line that will affect agriculture. And then finish up talking about why it's important, why I think it's important that we pursue these avenues of technologies, GMOs and transgenics, biotechnology included. So if you have any questions, you don't have to wait till the end. If you have a question during the middle of the presentation, don't hesitate to raise your hands and we'll try to get to it. So what are GMOs? Well, genetically modified organisms. So it's any organism whose genetic information has been altered. Now that alteration can happen in a variety of different ways. It can be through natural selection. It can be through mutagenesis. So sunlight causes changes in genetic material. Okay, skin cancer. That's basically a mutation in your DNA that causes skin cancer. So that's a genetic change. Or other ways, other techniques of making genetic changes in plants. Okay, and I'm dealing specifically, and I'm going to be talking specifically about plants tonight. So what is biotechnology? It's basically the tools that we use to be able to make those changes. And those tools have changed dramatically over the past 10 years. We're dealing with technologies now that make it much easier to make genetic changes in plants and to make genetic improvement and genetic gain in plants. Why are we interested in that? Well, we've got a world population that continues to grow and a lot of hungry mouths to feed and to clothe. And so my contention is that this technology that we're developing is one of the tools that is very valuable in the ability for us to feed ourselves and to clothe ourselves. Okay? So the king of Brobdingnag from Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift said in 1927, whoever can make 2 ears of corn or 2 blades of grass grow upon a spot of ground where only one grew before would deserve better of mankind and do more essential service to his country than the whole race of politicians put together. So basically that's through this technology of genetic changes and genetic improvement, that's basically what we're trying to do. We're trying to produce more food for a growing population on the earth. So A little bit of perspective. So how long has genetic modification been around? Any ideas? Yeah, a long time. So we've been making changes in plants since the dawn of time. So if you look at this picture right here, this is teosinte. That is the ancestor of modern day corn. Look at the size of that ear, about the size of a quarter. This is what we have today. So how did we get from a plant that produced an ear of corn that's about the size of your finger to a plant that produced an ear of corn that's that big, that long, and that big around? We made changes in the genetic information in that plant. So we'd plant the plant, we'd select the best, we'd save that seed, and we'd plant that. And then over time, we would make genetic improvement. But we had no idea what we were doing. We were just basically picking the best and saving it and planting it the next year. And over time, continuously, we would select for the traits that we wanted. Same thing with tomato. That's what a tomato used to look like. So how do we get from here to here? By making genetic changes, genetic improvement. So traditionally, how that's been done is you take two plants that are compatible with each other and you cross them, and you see what you get out of it, okay? And that's what this picture up here is. This middle ear right here is a cross between this ear and that ear, or that plant, these two plants, and that's what you get out of the middle. So it has some genes from the plant on the left, and it has some genes from the plant on the right. And so over time, you select for better and more healthy, nutritious food that comes from these plants. All right, so how did we do it through traditional plant breeding? As I mentioned, you take two plants, and let's say we have a gene right here, and that gene we want in this plant, okay? How do we do it? We cross-pollinate them. Cross-pollinate them, you end up with a plant that's got some genetic from the male and some genetic information from the female, and hopefully you have the desired gene. But there's a lot of other stuff that gets transferred in there. And then you have to go back through a process of what's called back crossing to try to get all of the other stuff that you don't want that's in there out. Well, now we can do it through biotechnology in a much more precise way. So now we can go in with genetic tools and identify a gene that we want, take that gene out of the organism, and insert it into the plant that we want it into. So no longer do we have to necessarily crossbreed plants and then get this whole mess of genetic information. We can now select the gene that we know exactly what it does. It's very well characterized. We know how it behaves. And we insert that gene into the variety that we want. And now we have just the genetic information that we want plus the gene. And I'm going to give you some examples. I know this is a little abstract, particularly if you're not necessarily a science major. But I'll give you some examples of how this has been done. Okay? So in 1972, the very first genetically modified organism was created. They took DNA molecules from a bacteria and a virus, and they spliced them together to make a functional DNA molecule. And then that was inserted into a bacteria. So they genetically modified that bacteria. And that really was the first time in 1972 that this was done. In 1992 was the very first genetically modified crop that was brought into public consumption. Any of you ever heard of the Flavor Saver tomato in 1992? That was a tomato that was developed to have a longer shelf life. And so what they did, they basically found the gene that coded for ethylene, which is a compound that ripens fruit, and they took that gene out and turned it around. And so the tomato would remain ripe, wouldn't ripen as quickly and would have a longer shelf life. Well, there wasn't a whole lot of understanding about genetic modification at that time, and it never really got through the process of being approved by USDA, EPA, and FDA, and so it never really went anywhere. But that was the first one that was developed. It was developed by a company called Calgene. The first ones that really went into commercial production was in 1996. And there has been, if you read the popular press, there's a lot of information about GMOs, a lot of negative information that you can read about genetically modified organisms, okay? But really, I think part of what I try to do is try to educate individuals about what these products are and how they can benefit us. Okay? And I'm going to give you a couple of concrete examples of how these products have made a difference, particularly in this area. So what are some of the common ones that are in use today? Well, the first one is built-in protection against insects. So now we have plants that produce proteins that are toxic to pests, insect pests. And I'll give you some examples of that. Bacillus thuringiensis is the first one. Herbicide tolerance. How many of you ever heard of Roundup? How many of you ever used Roundup? Okay, very good herbicide. We now have crops that are tolerant to Roundup application, meaning you can take Roundup, spray it over the top of the plant survives, and it kills the weeds. It's a very effective technique that we can use for weed control. Allows non-selective herbicides such as Roundup to be applied over the top of the crop without injury. And then also disease protection. I'll show you a couple of examples of that too. Built-in protection in the plant to prevent it from getting infected by different diseases. So these are some of the crops that are commercially now grown that are genetically modified, what we call GMOs or transgenic plants. Everything you eat, everything out there is in one way or another genetically modified. But these are the crops that have gone through the process of being improved with genetic modification and transgenics, genes coming from one organism and inserting it into the crop of interest. So corn, soybean, cotton, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa, papaya, squash, poplar, tomatoes, sweet peppers, and potatoes. So as I mentioned, thousands of years ago, we've been making improvements in plants just through natural selection, okay? Farmers began to crossbreed in the late 1800s. That's when they would take two plants and cross them and see what they got out. Breeders and researchers would look to introduce more genetic variation, and they do that through chemical means. They bombard, they radiate plants to get genetic information changed in the plant. That was one way to create genetic variability. And then again, in the 1980s, they figured out how to identify single genes and move those single genes from one organism to another. 1996 was really the big year when GM cotton, genetically modified cotton and corn, was brought onto the scene and was commercially available in the US. And then since then, we have papaya, canola, alfalfa, sugar beets, GM potatoes in 2016, apples, not yet, but there's products out there now that are being tested that will be released soon. So where are they being planted? Well, all over the world. Genetically modified crops have been adopted by farmers and growers all over the world. This is the total number of hectares in the world that are planted to transgenic crops. These are industrial countries and these are developing countries. And what's interesting is to see this trend of the adoption rate in developing countries. And we're seeing more and more of developing countries, poorer countries, that are adopting this technology and using it in their farming systems. So these are the number of hectares that are grown of these different crops. These are the four main genetically modified crops that take up the majority of the acreage that's planted. You have soybeans, corn, cotton, and canola. And what's interesting is if you look at the increase in planted acreage from 1996 to 2016, it's been a 110-fold increase. Yeah.
So, I mean, you can plan them, but the critical thing is how much product you get, right? It's not necessarily how much you plant. Is the product related to that? Or?
So yes, yields have increased with the use of transgenic products. But the real benefit that we've seen is the reduction in pesticide use because of these products that we've used. And it's made it more efficient. Growers have been able to be more efficient with growing the crop, less expense in terms of controlling pests because of this technology. Yes, Kristen.
So Randy, is the cost of the seeds for GMO crops less than traditional seeds?
No, considerably more, considerably more. So the cost of transgenic seed is much greater than conventional seed. But if you look at the benefits that you get in the reduction in pesticide use, that you're not having to spend, and I'll give you some examples here in just a minute, it actually, you spend less money if you're planting transgenic seeds. Yeah, but that's a good question. So the companies that develop this technology, there is a premium for this technology, and growers are paying that premium because they see the benefit in it, in their systems. All right, these are the countries across the world, and I know there's a lot on this slide, But the United States is #1 in terms of where GMO crops are grown globally. But you see a lot of developing countries, South Africa, a lot of developing countries that are beginning to adopt this technology in a very, very rapid rate.
Is the United States, you say they're #1 in using that, are they also #1 in the research for that?
And developing, yeah. Yeah, the vast majority of the products, well, in fact, all of the products that are out there now commercially available were developed in the US. Yeah. But there are new products that are under development now that are coming from all over the world. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that here in just a minute. Okay, so the first one I want to talk to you about is BT, Bacillus thuringiensis. Bacillus thuringiensis is a soil microbe. Lives in the soil, it's all over, it's ubiquitous. And it has a sequence in it that produces a protein that when a lepidopteran pest or a worm eats that protein, what do you think happens to the worm? Kills it. So what did they do? They identified that gene, they isolated that gene, and they inserted it into the cotton plant, and they also inserted it into the corn plant. So now when a worm begins to eat on that plant, what happens to the worm? It dies. You don't have to spray it with pesticides. The plant produces that protein is toxic to that pest, and it kills the pest. Okay, and I'll give you some examples of how we've seen the changes in pesticide use here in the state because of this. But this is the bollworm. This is actually the same pest that infects cotton that also infects corn. You can see this half of the field does not have the gene in it, and what happened is the worms ate all of the seed in those bolls, and it didn't produce any lint. Same thing here. This is a corn stalk that's infected by the Southwest or the European corn borer. Okay, that's a stalk that has the gene in it, and that's a stalk that doesn't. So it's very effective. It's very effective, and it's very specific. And that's the neat thing about this product is it's very specific to just that pest. Yeah.
But where does the protein end up in the plant? Is it in the leaves?
It's
Is it in the fruit?
it's expressed throughout the entire plant.
So when you bite into a piece of corn, you'd be eating that same protein.
You'd be eating that same protein. And if you were like a worm and you had a gut that had a pH of 9 or higher, you would have problems. So to other, again, like I said, it's very specific just to worms, just to these lepidopteran pests. And a lot of these things are all a matter of dose too. I mean, the amount that you're ingesting of this protein is not nearly enough to do any damage to you whatsoever. Kim, you have a question?
Well, I would just ask that what type of information is.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are hypersensitive.
Yep.
So that.
Well, I can tell you that all of these products that have been developed and been released have gone through many, many years of testing to ensure that they are safe for consumption. And really, there really hasn't ever been any scientific evidence that proves that any of these products cause health issues. In fact, I'll give you another reference of a study that just actually came out just in 2016 that was done by the National Academy of Sciences that came to the exact same conclusion that was done in 2000. These things are evaluated very, very often to ensure that they are safe. Okay. All right, so this is the pink bollworm. Okay, this is the pest that we deal with, or used to deal with here in Arizona. One of the most destructive pests in Arizona cotton production for many years. Tremendous cost. How many of you are from this area? Okay, do you remember what it used to be like here in the 80s and 90s? What would you see during the summer? What would you hear out in the fields? Crop dusters. When was the last time you heard a crop duster? Yeah. Okay, and that's really the beauty of this story. So if you think, and Kim, you make a very good point. You think about the number of pesticides that have the reduction in pesticide use because of this technology has been tremendous. Okay, and those pesticides that we used, significant use of pesticides, both aerial and ground applications to try to control this pest, those have completely been done away with. And some pretty harsh chemicals, by the way. So we have been involved, the state of Arizona has been involved in what's called the pink bollworm eradication program. It started out in Texas and it's moved progressively across the southwestern U.S. basically using this technology of BT cotton to eradicate that pest from our production systems. Several different techniques that were used: cultural control, mating disruption, but this was the big one right there. We planted 100% BT cotton. So this is a 100% transgenic cotton that is resistant to that pest. It's not wanting to move forward. There we go. So if you look at pesticide use in the state of Arizona, okay, this is a very good example of how this technology has made a big difference. I know this is a busy slide. This goes back to 1990, okay? But this is the number of pesticide sprays per acre of cotton in the state. You can see that in the 1990s, we're in this range of 12 insecticide sprays, and you would see that here in this valley. You'd see 10, 11, 12 times of some pretty harsh chemicals that were used to try to control those pinkies. The introduction of BT came in 1996. There have been a lot of other things that have also been developed, but you can see now in the state of Arizona, we went through a time here where there was less than 2 insecticide sprays per acre of cotton across the entire state. That's a dramatic decrease in the amount of pesticide load in the environment. And it's, again, all because of the BT cotton. Yes?
Do we have chemicals nowadays that, for like Arizona, that protect against heat, against dryness?
No, not yet. But that's something that's heat stress in cotton in Arizona is a very significant issue. And so researchers are working on developing, through a lot of different technologies, using traditional plant breeding and also transgenic breeding, to develop varieties that are more heat tolerant. But unfortunately, I mean, we have made some progress, but that's a very difficult one to conquer. All right, the other technology I want to mention to you here that's really made a change for us here in Arizona is herbicide technology. As I mentioned before, Roundup is a broad spectrum. Roundup will kill anything green that you put it on, it will kill it. In 1996, it was released corn and cotton varieties that are resistant to Roundup. So you can come in and spray Roundup right over the top of the crop. The weeds die, but the crop continues to grow unaffected. Okay, and so that's been an excellent technology that we've used in Arizona. Now, it's had some issues. I'll be the first one to admit there's been a lot. So we talk about the use of insecticides has decreased, but if you look at the use of herbicide and the use of Roundup, it actually has increased because of the adoption of Roundup ready crops or Roundup tolerant crops. And so growers have relied on this technology to the point where now we have some species of weeds that you can't kill with Roundup. Okay, so glyphosate resistant pigweed has been an issue that we deal with in Arizona now. Up until 2012 was the first year that we confirmed we had Roundup resistant pigweed. But that is an issue. This is the number of unique resistant cases for different countries and in Europe. So this line right here, the blue one, is the U.S. So you can see the number of herbicide-resistant instances that we've encountered in the U.S. So that is something that we have to deal with. It's largely a management problem, though. And it's happened because growers have used reduced rates of these herbicides, sublethal doses. Incorrect timing has also been an issue. Heavy reliance on just one chemical, and that's Roundup. And so we've tried to educate growers about using different types of chemicals, and they're getting on board and making some significant changes that are helping them deal with some of the herbicide-resistant weeds in the state. Okay, so those are two examples of pest control. But there are some additional examples that I think are pretty exciting. One of them is drought tolerance. Now, you talked about heat tolerance. We don't necessarily have heat tolerance, but we do have drought tolerance. And the two are kind of closely related. But we do have varieties of corn at this point that are tolerant to reduced levels of precipitation. And so you have corn with the gene, with the drought tolerant gene, and corn without it. So 9 to 14% increase over 3 years with the best performing transgenic event. So some additional benefits, and these are benefits that you know, the consumer doesn't necessarily see, but the producer or the grower definitely sees it. More precise development of new varieties with enhanced features. We see a definite reduction in insecticide use, not necessarily herbicide use, but definite reduction in insecticide use. Pest-resistant plants, insects, pathogens, BT, we talked about that. Now we talked about Roundup Ready, but we also have 2,4-D, which is another herbicide, and also dicamba, which we now have crops that are tolerant to those herbicides. But a lot of work is being put into this right here, environmental stress tolerance. So looking at salinity, plants that are more resistant to saline water and saline soils, acidity, metal toxicity, drought tolerance, and heat tolerance. So what are some of the benefits to consumers? Well, a lot of the things that have been developed, some of the products that have been developed are enhanced levels of essential amino acids, enhanced nutrition in products, golden rice, and I'll talk about this a little more in detail here in just a minute, but fighting vitamin A deficiency, potatoes that contain less starch, that absorb less oil when they're fried. Kenyan scientists, they're coming out with a vitamin A enhanced sorghum variety that's being done through transgenic technology that will be released hopefully in the next few years, and that's coming directly from Kenya. Preventing and curing diseases. Over 50% of all the marketed drugs are derived from fungi, bacteria, and plants. And so being able to genetically modify and insert genes that do specific things will allow the development of new disease-fighting drugs. Also providing renewable resources. There's some industrial lubricants that genetically modified different grains that will produce these lubricants that can then be a renewable source of these different products that can be used in manufacturing. And that's all being done through genetic engineering. So this is the one I wanted to tell you about. This is the golden rice. Vitamin A deficiency, well, let me back up. Rice is a staple for a lot of people around the world. I mean, that's the main thing they eat. But rice is not necessarily all that nutritious in terms of its vitamin A. And so a lot of people that subsist on rice as their primary diet, they can develop vitamin A deficiency, which can actually lead to blindness. So what scientists did is they found a gene from Narcissus, which is daffodil, and also a gene from Erwinia, which is a bacteria. They inserted those genes into the rice plant, and now it produces the precursor to vitamin A. So when you consume that, your body then produces vitamin A. So that's in the process. The International Rice Research Institute is in the process of developing that, and it should be released on the market here very soon. Other food products, cucumber mosaic virus, watermelon mosaic virus, zucchini yellow mosaic virus, all of these different viruses, they've been able to genetically modify. Basically, they take the protein that encodes for the coat that goes over this virus. So when a virus infects, it sheds its coat protein and allows it to infect the host cell. Well, what they've been able to do is use that coat protein to basically confuse the virus so that the coat protein is already in the plant. When the virus invades, it senses that protein is there and it can't shed its own coat protein. And so it makes it so it cannot invade or infect that plant. And so these different mosaic viruses that before now have never had any means of control, now through this technology we can control these viruses in these crop plants. So what are some of the potential risks? Well, there are potential risks. There are risks with everything that we do. But I think what we have to do is we have to basically look at the risks versus the benefits and make a decision. I mean, there's risks in getting in your car or getting on your bike and riding to class in the morning. You know, there's risks with everything that we do. And so we have to weigh those risks versus the benefits. But there are some issues, as I mentioned before, weediness. We have run into issues with development of herbicide-resistant weeds. We have not had any issues with insects that have become resistant to any of the products. And part of the reason we haven't seen that yet is that we've developed, the first product was a single gene product. It only had one gene in there that protected against the insect pest. Now we have 3 and 4 gene products that have additional genes So if you have an insect pest that is resistant to one, the likelihood of them being resistant to all 4 is very low. And so by inserting additional genes in there that produce different toxic proteins, you're able to decrease the likelihood of an insect becoming resistant to that. Okay? So a little bit about the regulatory process, about the development of these products. It is a very, very long process that these technologies go through before they're ever released in the environment. It's usually about a 13-year process from discovery before it's ever released into the environment. And then once it's released into the environment, there's very strict regulations about how it can be used. And a lot of the research that I do is on the very end of this, just right before it gets to market. And so oftentimes what we have to do, we do what are called confined field trials, where we have to ensure that any of the product that we plant is destroyed on site, that it can't get into commerce. And so we'll plant a field of cotton and we end up having to burn that and destroy that cotton right in the field to ensure that it doesn't get into commerce. So there's a lot of oversight in how these products are developed and tested before they're released into the environment. So you're looking at 13 years of development on average for any technology. So like the BT technology that we talked about, that was 13 years, released in 96, but it was probably discovered in the early 80s and began testing in the early 80s. And upwards of over $150 million in cost in developing just one single technology. There are several agencies that regulate the development of these products to ensure their safety. And these are the 3 main ones: USDA, EPA, to ensure that it's safe to grow. EPA is ensure that it's safe for the environment, and the FDA ensures that it's safe for consumption. Okay, and every product goes through this whole process of testing before it's ever released into the environment. So are they safe to consume? Well, there's been a lot of research done, and there continues to be research done, coming up with basically the same answer. That GMOs that are available today are as safe as their non-GMO counterparts. They do not cause new allergies, cancer, infertility, ADHD, autism, or any other disease or condition. Their safety has been affirmed by all of these different agencies. Yes, you may.
Because it was mentioned also for my nutrition classes here. When we talk about it, there's a lot of people that believe that GMOs create because they do create because there's more protein. And proteins are what create inflammatory.
Well, I wouldn't say there's more protein. There's not more protein. There's different proteins. There's different.
There's different. There's different. And so the reality is, though, is that it's really what causes more of our inflammatory reactions is not the GMOs, it's our processed food. It's all of the food that goes through a processing, like their foods that are packaged, things like that. Those are the foods that are causing more inflammatory responses than anything that's like this. Right. And so I think it's worth mentioning that there's a lot of people out there that believe that the GMOs really are the ones that are causing a lot of these problems. And there's not been a lot of evidence, but there's lots of evidence about the way we process our foods. Yeah.
Well, and I would argue that there has been no reproducible evidence that shows that GMOs have caused any of these issues. Now, correlation is not causation. So just because you have a rise in GMO use and you have a rise in autism does not mean they're correlated to each other at all. Okay, you have to prove that there is a correlation. There could be many other factors that could affect a lot of different things, and the studies have been done. And I'll give you a reference to a report that I'd encourage you, if you have questions, to go read this report. And it outlines all of the trials that have been done, and the studies that have been done. Yeah.
I was just about to ask, has ASU done studies showing support for GMOs?
I would imagine so. They do have a department that does a lot of work with that. Now they don't necessarily do a lot of the agricultural work and the testing work, but they do have programs that do lab work.
They have architectural sciences, right?
Yeah, that I don't know. Yeah, I think they do have some, but a lot of the research, at least that's done in the state of Arizona by universities, is done by the University of Arizona because they are the land grant college in the state. Okay, all of these organizations have come out in agreement in terms of the safety surrounding these products. Yes. Yes. Yeah. NRCS, so Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is a division of the United States Department of Agriculture. Yeah, they are involved in testing, evaluation of these products. But again, they're more on the tail end, like we are with the University of Arizona, not necessarily in the development of the technologies, but in the evaluation of the technologies and learning ways to apply those technologies to our systems. But yes, they are definitely involved. So this is the report that just came out, done by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. I thought I put the URL up here. I guess I didn't. But if you just go on and Google genetically engineered crops, experiences, and prospects, this report came out in May of 2016. And basically, this is the summary. It says, while recognizing the inherent difficulty of detecting subtle and long-term effects in health and the environment, the study committee found no substantiated evidence of a difference in risks to human health between currently commercialized genetically engineered crops and conventionally bred crops. So again, I think it's important to understand that genetic engineering and genetic manipulation has been going on for thousands of years. The way we're doing it today is actually safer than the way we did it before, because you can characterize, you can take a gene that you know exactly what that gene does, you know what it does, you know how it behaves, you insert it into the plant that you want it in, and it's very well characterized. Instead of taking two plants and just crossing them or irradiating those plants to create genetic variability and then seeing what you get out, okay? So there's a much higher level of safety in terms of what is being developed today than what was developed before. So why is it important that we pursue these techniques? In my opinion, it's important because it is not the only solution, but it is one of the solutions to developing enough food and fiber to feed the world. So this is an interesting graphic that was put together. There's another website that I'll point you towards. It's called gmoanswers.com. Very excellent. It might be .org, gmoanswers.org, I forget. It's either .com or .org. But they put a lot of good information together, science-based information that will give you good facts about GMOs. There's expected to be a 30% increase in world population by 2050, so a higher demand for food, fiber, and fuel. So how are we going to develop that? How are we going to make sure that we have plenty? Well, you either take land that has never been in production and you plant crops on that land, or you learn how to develop products and technologies that will produce more yield and more food on the land that's currently in use. In 2015, GMOs allowed farmers to use 48.2 million less acres of land to produce the same amount of crops. And how do they do that? Well, they do it through increased weed control, increased insect control. All of those things have allowed them to grow more product on the same acres of land. That makes sense? So without GMOs or access to those GMOs, in order to produce the same amount, they would have had to have planted 18.2 million more acres of corn, 20 million acres of soybeans, 7 million acres of cotton, and 1 million acres of canola, just to keep up with those levels. So the technologies have allowed us to be more efficient and more productive in the land that we currently grow food and fiber on. All right, but again, let me just finish up with a couple of slides here. This, again, is not the only technique. We continue to develop fertilizers and techniques for applying fertilizers, higher efficiency irrigation systems, higher efficiency harvesting systems. All of these things will help us produce the food and the fiber that's needed to feed the world. But again, plant biotechnology, I think, is a key piece in this sustainable ag puzzle. I think I got one more slide here. I just want to mention one thing. We live on a hungry planet. It's estimated that about 1.85 billion people are hungry, go hungry every night in the world today. 36 million people in the US go hungry. 2.5 to 6 million people in Zambia go hungry, yet their president refused an offer of free corn to their country because it was GMO. And the problem with a lot of this is just lack of education and not understanding that these genetic changes are something that we've been doing for thousands of years. And again, that they're very safe and they've been tested. Just one comment about some new technologies that are coming out. I don't know if any of you follow any science things, but this new technology called CRISPR-Cas9 was just really discovered here in the past couple of years. But it's a new technology that allows researchers to identify even more precisely genetic information and genes within an organism. It's more precise in terms of going in and cutting out specific genetic information and inserting it into another organism, into another plant. So this is really going to revolutionize and move forward in a much quicker way some of these products that are being developed. So again, I believe it's a very strong tool that will help us solve the hunger and malnutrition problems across the globe, and we really are just kind of scratching the tip of the iceberg, I believe, in the things that are going to be developed in the future. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any other questions if you have any. Yes, Kristen.
So Randy, are foods required to have a label that says they contain GMO?
Currently, no. Now that's up for debate. You know, originally a lot of the companies and industries that developed the GMOs their position was they didn't care, but whether or not things were labeled. But as more and more information has come out about their equivalency to non-GMO products, there's been more and more of a pushback against labeling, because really, according to the science, there's no difference between a GMO product and a non-GMO product, so why label it, okay? Now, I mean, I can see both sides of the argument. If a person wants to know, but I can tell you that probably 90% of any product that has any corn in it whatsoever has GMOs in it. Sugars, corn sugars, and there's a lot of products that come from corn. 90% of the acreage of corn in the United States is GMO corn. And it has been since 1996. So we've been consuming those products really since that time. But yeah, that's a good question about labeling. Other questions? Yeah, Kim. Well, so if you go and you read some of these research reports, you know, a lot of them are one-time research reports that are not reproducible. They haven't been. So I think it's important to understand that when science is done, and when you do a study of any kind, it has to be done in a way that can be reproduced. And if a scientist could say, okay, this scientist found this result, now I'm going to go do the exact same study, and I should come up with the exact same result, okay? But there have not been any studies, valid scientific studies that have shown, that are reproducible, that have shown negative effects of these products in human health. And there have been many, I can tell you, many studies that have been done that have shown that there's no difference whatsoever in terms of their effect on human health when compared to a non-GMO counterpart. Yes?
You mentioned that they're hoping to modify plants to accept salt.
Mm-hmm.
Is that so that they could use ocean water maybe to?
Potentially. Or grow crops on soils that they couldn't grow before. You know, a lot of the land across the world that is farmable is saline. Most of the most fertile soils across the world have salinity issues. Right here in this valley, we have salinity issues. And so if we can develop crops that can tolerate higher levels of salinity and still produce economical yield, then that's a benefit to all of us. So yeah.
Is there any move to modify wheat?
Yes, there is. There currently aren't any genetically modified wheat varieties out there that are commercially available. But there is research that's going into herbicide tolerant wheat, and also other protein enhancements in wheat products to increase protein levels. Yes?
Over the career that some of these nutritionists, some of these young scientists, how can they get into, what's a good entry point? Where do they transfer to? What's it even called?
Well, so for a lot of these topics that we've talked about tonight, you would need basically a microbiology type degree that you would go into. I would suggest that you would pursue a degree at a land-grant college, particularly if you're interested in the agricultural sciences, whether it's the University of Arizona or Texas A&M or LSU. You know, all of these schools are land-grant universities that would have programs in these areas, these discipline areas. But you would basically need a genetic microbiology type degree, and you would get a background in genetics and you know, all of the things, breeding, things like that you would need. And in my opinion, I think it's an exciting time to be involved in these sciences. I mean, you look at this, if you're interested, there's some really good articles on this new technology that's called CRISPR-Cas9, and some TED Talks, some excellent TED Talks that have been given about this new technology. It's going to revolutionize not only agricultural sciences, but it's going to revolutionize health sciences and gene therapies and things like that in humans. I mean, it's amazing what's coming down the line in terms of new technologies. So if you have any interest in that, I think it's an exciting time to be involved in those sciences.
Well, does anyone else have any additional questions that you would like to ask Dr. Norton? Well, thank you all for attending tonight. We have recorded this, so this will go up on the library's website under our One Book, One Campus program. If you are in Professor Morris's class, please make sure that you do sign legibly so that he can read it up here before you leave. And that's all that I have. JP, did you have anything? Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.